Mim presents a Monsters mashup.
I'm scared.
It'll be alright.
Mim. Do you ever get that creepy feeling that somebody or something is watching you? It usually starts with an itch on the back of your neck, or a change in air pressure when you're by yourself in a room. It almost feels as if the room has gotten smaller. Suddenly, you feel a little bit colder. You're no longer alone, or so you think. I've heard that other people experience this from time to time. Please tell me that it's true, and that it's normal. You see, I've been experiencing those exact sensations every night for the past week, and I'm beginning to fear for my life. It all started with my newfound love of all things horror. Horror movies, horror books, creepypastas, you name it. This was quite a change for me. Before, I couldn't even sit through Nightmare on Elm Street without covering my eyes each time Freddy made an appearance on the screen. I was a total wimp. When my interest in horror began, around 2 months ago, I felt as if I was on top of the world. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself, but all of my initial fear of the ghosts and ghouls faded away for some unknown reason. I'm writing this because, well, I'm starting to get scared again. The following are all of the events that have been plaguing me of sleep for the last 2 weeks. Monday, April 1st, about 2 weeks ago. I came home from school after another monotonous day. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. My legs ached from a long, hard run on the high school track. Running has always been one of my strong points, as opposed to football, basketball, or any other contact sport. When I walked through my front door, I kicked off my New Balance trainers and proceeded to walk towards my bedroom, giving an unenthusiastic hello to my mom. I stepped through my doorway and closed the door behind me. It was early spring, so the sun was already approaching setting on the horizon. It cast an orange glow in my bedroom before disappearing behind some houses in the distance only minutes later. Alone in my bedroom, I decided to get on my computer and play some video games before going to bed and disregarding all of my homework. Sitting down at my desk, I logged into my PC and waited for the familiar welcome of my desktop wallpaper. I think it was some fan art from the game Undertale, but I'm not sure. I've since changed it at least once. After playing TES, Skyrim, my favorite game if you were curious, for about an hour, I decided to call it a night. I don't normally go to bed before 10 o'clock, but I was willing to make an exception tonight. Like I said, track practice had me tired and sore. I turned off my lights and laid in bed for maybe 5 minutes before sleep overcame me. That was the last peaceful moment I've had to this day. Suddenly I sat up in bed, sweating profusely and breathing hard. I glanced over at my alarm clock. It read 2:36 a.m. Scanning my room for whatever could have woken me up, my eyes caught a glimpse of something outside my window. 2 glowing white eyes were staring straight at me from the woods behind my house. This might sound strange, but I wasn't startled by this. At first. You see, I live in Montana, which statistically has a higher population of deer than it does people. Heck, in the summer, deer are the primary causes of car accidents around my town. These glowing orbs were probably just the reflections of light off of a deer's eyes, which was a common sight while driving down the highway at night. Before I could turn over and go back to sleep, however, I realized something. The eyes were too far apart to be a deer. Also, it was the middle of the night, and there was no light that could possibly have been reflecting. Disturbing as these realizations were, I was too tired to keep dwelling on it. I slowly pulled my covers over my head, closed my eyes, and spent the remainder of my night in dreamland. The following morning, I had little to no recollection of the night's events, and hurriedly got ready for school. Friday, April 5th. The next few days had been pretty uneventful. School was mundane as usual, track was painful, and each time I came home from school, I all but went straight to bed. Sleeping was not a problem those past 3 days either. I have yet to spot those glowing eyes in the woods, and waking up in the middle of the night hadn't been a problem. If anything, I'd slept like a baby. Well, actually, there was one incident that happened the night before, though it was too fleeting to merit my concern. I had been laying in my bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard some very faint breathing off to my left. I glanced over towards where the noise had been coming from. My eyes locked onto my closet. The door was slightly cracked open. Before I had time to react, I lost consciousness again. Saturday, April 13th. It had been a while since anything peculiar happened. I had just gotten home from a day-long track meet in a town 2 hours away. Once again, I was insanely tired, and made my best effort to walk to my bedroom without colliding with any walls. I fell into my bed and laid on my side, planning on sleeping until the afternoon of the following day. After around 10 minutes of still being awake, I began to notice something. An odd smell in my bedroom. It wasn't necessarily a bad smell, just out of place. It was a musty, earthy smell, like the smell of wet wood combined with what I imagined to be the smell of dirt. Also, the room felt colder. This to me was far more terrifying than the incidences from a week earlier. My breaths became short and raspy as I began to grasp that I was no longer alone. My bedroom felt small, isolated like a prison cell. I wanted to roll over and see what was behind me, but my body felt paralyzed. Then I realized something that made my blood turn cold. I had been holding my breath the entire time. The raspy breathing continued. Maybe it didn't know that I was awake, I thought to myself. Maybe if I spun around quickly I could catch it by surprise. What I planned to do after that still remains a mystery. Without wasting another second, I rolled over on my bed and hurled my pillows towards the creature with all of my strength. Only there was no creature. I was still alone in my room. The sinister atmosphere in my bedroom had faded, but I was still shaken. Sunday, April 14th. The events from last night have not by any means left my memory. In fact, I stayed up for the remainder of that night playing video games. Sleep was impossible. Tonight I feel as if sleep is still a fantasy. As I sit here in the dark typing this out, I am reminded of that horrible feeling, that ominous, creeping feeling of being watched. No, not watched. Stalked. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that I'm feeling it again. Dezombified.
My earliest memories are of my mother telling me to stay away from the fairy door. I knew the tales, of course. Everyone did. The fairy door led to the world of the other folk. Sinister, evil creatures that looked like regular people, but who possessed a sinister motive. They will offer you baubles, Mother said. They'll promise you wonders and pleasures beyond imagining. They'll promise you anything to get you across the other side. And when you do, you'll die. Of course, I never really believed. I had never seen any other folk, nor had my friends or my family. I wish I had paid heed. In my memories, my home was always summer. I would fly up and down the hills, all save the one on which the door stood. I would weave through the trees and laugh as their branches snatched at me. I would splash along the shore of the lake, delighting at the feel of wet mud squelching between my toes. That was my world. In time, this play led to a discovery of mimicry. Of all the animals I could imitate, the birds were my favorite, and before long, I was so talented that I could lure them in with my songs. When they realized I was not a bird, they would startle and fly away, which always delighted me, not out of malice, but simple childhood joy of a trick well played. It was such a trick that damned me. I had lured a dunnock to me, and when startled, he flew away up the hill towards the door. I gave chase, pausing as he darted through the old stone arch and emerged unharmed on the other side. Well, what more proof did a young child need of safety? So I went after him in kind, through the stone arch and into the other side. Words cannot describe the agony I experienced then. Every inch of skin was awash with burning cold. My chest was being both crushed from without and bursting from within. My insides twisted and writhed unbearably. All this torment forced me to my knees, and there was nothing I could do but gulp down air, for even crying out was too much for me. In this tormented state, I didn't spot the other until he was almost on top of me. I suppose it was some deep survival instinct that took over. You may have heard stories of men sawing off a trapped limb to escape death, or mothers lifting a flipped car to rescue a child. I think it was such an impulse that made me see him through all my pain and terror, and gave me such perfect clarity of thought. I composed myself, keeping still and silent as he emerged from the rain-soaked greenery to stand before me. The other was tall and broad-shouldered, with long hair and an unkempt beard of wild orange hair. He wore strange clothing of black and dark red, and he used a long staff of oak as a walking stick. He looked at me with great surprise, at first doing nothing but stare. I returned his gaze without speaking, trembling gently beneath his stare.
God, what are you doing here?
He gasped, hurrying over to me and taking off his coat to wrap around me. I am unsure how long he questioned me, but I remembered my lessons well. I told him nothing. For if an other has your name, he has power over you. Perhaps he took my silence for shock, for in time he gave up questioning me and lifted me up in his broad, strong arms and hurried away back to his home. There were many more questions there. His wife was no less curious, but at least she did not pester me so. The coat was replaced with a soft blanket, and I was sat at the table. She made me a simple meal, which I declined at first until the pain of hunger overwhelmed me. It was the greatest meal I had ever tasted. Before long, I was being interrogated, not only by the other family, but by their soldiers as well. They wanted not only me, but my mother and father also. The idea that my foolishness might cost them their lives as well caused overwhelming grief in me, and I cried openly. That was enough for the man to dismiss the soldiers and carry me off to a soft bed to rest. Tired and heartbroken as I was, I found comfort there that night. Fed, watered, and warm, the worst of my pains had left me, though not at all, for the pain of this world never entirely leaves me to this day. The long weeks and months that followed were hard for me. Eventually, the others seemed to accept that my family was beyond their reach and settled for me alone. As I would not give them a name, I was called Sarah. The others who looked after me gave me the false names John and Mary to use. They also gave me gifts, and such gifts. There were clothes first, pretty dresses for wearing in the day, soft clothes for sleeping in, then brightly colored outfits for walking in the hills. I had never worn clothes before, but my love of them soon overcame any fear of some other curse they carried. When they took me to the hills, which was a boon I won within a few weeks of being taken, I went always and eagerly to the ferry door. On this side, it was all but overgrown, and never was I able to pass through as I had done before. John knew what it was, of course, but pretended the people on the other side were just stories. Was this deliberate? Did they need to cut my link to my own people for some of their trickery to work? Many nights after, I shed my other trappings and braved the pain of cold to face the ferry door skyclad, but it still did not open. Months passed, and they arranged for me to go with the other children and learn about their world. They recognized me as strange, and some whispered within earshot that I was the fairy girl, but the adults always scolded them for that. I kept up my performance, despite how weary it made me. It was around this time I dared to test the fairy door in other ways. If it would not accept me as I was, then perhaps it would take me in another form. But try as I might, I could no longer mimic the birds and beasts. Perhaps the power was stolen when I crossed, or perhaps the others took it from me unawares. Knowing I would never know the feeling of fur or feathers was a fresh heartbreak, and for weeks I was sullen and depressed. I resolved that the only way I could survive now was to play the part fate had forced upon me. I had to become an other. I have played this role for 40 years. John and Mary are dead now, and I scattered their ashes around the fairy door. I shall miss them, for I now know they truly cared for me in their own way. Mary left the house to me, but I could not stay there. The mirrors of the house no longer show me a fair-faced child, but a red-headed woman with weather-worn skin and the first hints of gray in her brow. Instead, I live on the hill now, camping beside the fairy door. Day and night, I search and probe and beg for a way to open the door and go back to where I belong, where I will no longer know hunger or thirst or cold or the slow death of aging. Mother, I'm sorry I didn't listen. Please open the door. Please.
Mim. Nora was a kindred spirit, the love of my life, my best friend. But Nora's not real, not human. We met at the graveyard on that cold winter day. Mom had been dead for over a month. Somehow I kept finding myself there. I felt emotionless. She was the only thing I had left. And as cliché as it sounds, that's when the sweet girl said hello. She seemed pleasant. She looked stunning. Her voice was quiet, but her emerald eyes said a million things to me the moment I looked into them. She wore a blue jacket. Her brown hair fell over her shoulders perfectly. Her face was pale, yet so beautiful. She was my definition of perfection. I suppose the cliché part is where I say I fell for her instantly. But I didn't. Maybe she sensed my pain and misery, or maybe this was all a coincidence. Gradually I would take notice of her presence in my most active spots. The grocery store, the theater, the coffee shop on 10th Street, conveniently running into me. Looking back, I know she was there for a reason. She was searching for me. She never spoke to anyone other than me. As many times as I saw her in public spots, I was always her main focus. Our conversations were as normal as any others, but there was something about her, something that made her irresistible. I just had no clue of how. She finally told me on our third date. Her lips were soft, her hands were warm as I held them. But as she spoke, her quiet and faint voice turned direct yet hesitant. Those three simple words grabbed my attention. I'm not normal. She flashed a sincere smile trying to break the ice. I sat beside her with a puzzled look on my face. Did she have another guy? A husband? Did she have some sort of disease? My mind ran wild, but before I could even think, my voice blurted out something generic. Nora, whatever it is, baby, I'll love you. Okay, John, I'm a spirit. A demon, if you will. When I died, I was given a task. One too sinister to even share with you. If I do it, my spirit is free. I just can't bring myself to it. So I've been trapped. For years. I've been stuck here wishing, wanting to find a place where I belonged. But, John, now that I've found you, I don't want to leave anymore. I've been alone for so long. I just can't. I began chuckling as the words left her mouth. I expected her to burst out laughing, but she didn't. Tears ran down her perfect, pale face as I realized this was real. Real to her, at least. I wasn't easily convinced. I didn't believe in the paranormal. I had no reason to. But then she took me to the graveyard, the place we met. Her grave was undisturbed. Red and blue flowers flourished around it. She'd been dead for over 3 years. A car crash claimed her life. As we drove home that night, she uttered words that I'll never forget. "They're coming for me. They're gonna take me one day, John." She sounded so fearless. I nodded and fell away from reality as my mind tried to make sense of everything. By then, I was already flooded with questions. Why was she so real? She acted normal. She sounded so vivid. She felt so warm and loving. She summed it up as this: spirits aren't invisible. They appear in many shapes, sizes, and forms. She fortunately kept her human figure for her purpose on this earth. My mind always wondered about the details of her task. Who assigned it? Why? I wanted to talk about it. Wanted to ask. But the pain in her eyes every time the question arose would hit me like a brick. I suppose I'll figure that out soon enough. I suppose I may be assigned my own. You see, my beloved Nora was taken from me last night. I awoke to her shrieks and watched in horror as large faceless figures with sharp rows of teeth tore into her. I tried to fight back. I tried to plead. I tried to save her from her demise, but was met face to face with a creature pinning me against the wall. It had no facial features. It was purely just a mouth. The multiple rows of sharp teeth were filled with the flesh of Nora. Tears streamed down my face as I listened to my beloved getting the life taken from her once more. But just like that, the shrieks had stopped. The growling of the creatures had ceased, and I somehow awoke this morning to nothing. My once murderous household was now ghost quiet. Not a soul to be seen or heard from. Nora was gone. And that's why I'm writing this. I want a future with Nora. Meeting her was one of the best things in my life. I want to feel her touch. I want to kiss her. I want to live a life with her, even if that means giving up mine. Without her, I have nothing, no one. Tonight, I took a handful of pills and washed it down with bourbon. With luck, in about an hour, I'll drift off into sleep and meet my demise. I have no fear of dying, knowing Nora will be there on the other side, waiting. She'll be with me every step of the way, and now we can be together for eternity. Dezombified.
I live in a small town in Colorado, so word travels around quickly, but I've never heard this story. My grandma is 78 and lives in a care home. Occasionally, I go and visit her there, and we play card games, truth or dare, etc. She is one of the nicest people I have ever met, and she raised me when my parents were neglectful and verbally abusive. I remember once I had gone all day without eating. Since my mom had 2 jobs and my dad had 1, just to support us 3, and they couldn't afford food. I called my grandmother and she came and picked me up. We went out to some hole-in-the-wall pizza place which was having an all-you-can-eat day. Then she took me home with leftovers. She would feed me when my parents couldn't, teach me to be respectful and kind, give me clothes that actually fit me, and she even bought me a cat for my 12th birthday. She raised me like a mother should have. Now, nothing eventful ever really happens in this town. At least not that I know about. Except when an 8-year-old girl ran away from home and was found the next day. But that isn't very interesting. So one day I got in my car to drive to the old Sunny Willows care home. It was a warm summer day, and the garden around the fence of the care home was thriving. I closed the door of the car behind me in the parking lot and began to walk inside, a vase of roses and daisies in my left hand. I remember I had asked my grandma what her favorite kind of flowers were, and she'd gone on a rant about how wonderful roses smell, but that daisies were bright and beautiful, and she couldn't choose, so I got both for her. As I opened the door, I was greeted by the receptionist.
Hello, here to visit Candy Raymond again?
I nodded, I came here so often, most of the receptionists knew who I was. The blonde-haired woman led me down the wide hallways, wearing a laced yellow uniform. She was holding a clipboard and was walking, grinning cheerfully like she always was. This was Chloe, the youngest person they have in the staff, at a mere 18 years old. I saw her the most since she covered more of the morning shifts, which was when I went to see my grandmother, who I call Gran. The walls were baby blue, which my grandmother always complimented when I led her down the hallways to get breakfast. I recognized the hallway as soon as I saw it. She pointed to room 116, Gran's. I smiled and thanked Chloe, then knocked and gently opened the door. Gran was sitting down on her chair in front of the window, stroking her parakeet, Gretel's feathers. Astoundingly, the care home had allowed Gran to keep Gretel as long as she cleaned up after the bird. I vividly remember Gran crying, thanking them dearly. She was so very grateful to be able to keep her companion of 4 years. Gretel was the first one to notice me, chirping softly at my encounter. Gran looked up at me and smiled a toothy grin.
Nathaniel, great to see you, honey.
I sat down her flowers on the table alongside her other gifts from me and the family, including a stuffed animal cat, which is her favorite animal, a sparkled birthday card, a brand new large cage for Gretel, the old cage, and some food and millet for Gran's dear pet. Then I stood up and hugged Gran gently, sitting down beside her. We talked for at least a whole hour about lots of dumb and beautiful things and memories, until we got on the topic of scary stories. I asked her, "What's the scariest thing you've ever been through?" If you don't want to answer it, you don't have to. She glanced at Gretel, who was resting on her shoulder.
Oh, I don't know. Let me think.
She pursed her lips into a thin line for a minute, then widened her hazel eyes.
Oh, well, there was this time when I lived back in my old house, across from you, when I used to take care of you. Now you take care of me.
She joked, chuckling softly.
Well, one day I was walking around outside like I usually did. When I got home, I was sitting on the couch. I turned on my telly with the clicker, and I couldn't believe what the news was telling me. One of the neighborhood dogs had attacked and brutally murdered a nice lady I knew. Her name was Lisa, I think.
I blinked in shock. Really? She had got to be joking.
I remember looking out my window, and I heard police sirens. I wondered why I didn't hear them before, though.
She cleared her throat.
Then I walked outside and went around the corner, and sure enough, they were taking Lisa's corpse around and into an ambulance. There was punctures and wounds and blood. So much blood, let me tell you that. I couldn't believe my eyes. Her tummy was split open, her intestines hanging out like nothing you've ever seen. One of her eyes was halfway across the road. Her body was contorted so unnaturally, I couldn't explain it, even if I wanted to. But I knew a dog couldn't ever tear a whole scalp from her head, could it? I don't think that was possible.
I felt myself gag. No, I didn't think a dog could do that either.
I was in such a daze that I fell to the ground. A kind old man asked me if I was all right, and I remember grabbing onto his arm and screaming nonsense and blabber. I kept trying to tell him I was dreaming. I was so scared. I think that's the scariest thing I've got.
She chided. I took her to breakfast and then left early. I don't know why, but the story just messed me up, and she seemed a lot less traumatized by it than I was, even though I had only heard about it, and I felt sick to my stomach. I got myself a TV dinner and sat down, rewatching The Office for the 12th time. When I finished the first season, I glanced up from my seat, and out of the window was 2 yellow, glowing eyes, a round, shredded muzzle, pinned back ears, and 2 massive brown paws pressed up against the window.
Mim. To preface this story, I'm a female and still lived in Kentucky at the time this took place. My family owned 10 acres of land which were located out in the vast countryside and rolling hills. A large field sat adjacent to our house, but was outlined with dense woods to the left of our property. Sometimes in the evenings, after dinner, my husband and I would take walks in those woods. We found nature's ambience all around us to be peaceful. Crickets that serenaded us with gentle chirps and even the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance had become a form of relaxation. One night, however, we both learned just how unsettling things could be out in the country and in the dark. Equipped with wearable headlamps, we would go exploring through the paths we'd made in the thicket and overgrown brush. Our property led into the rear part of our next-door neighbor's land. He was cool with us trekking through as many acres as long as we steered clear of it during hunting season. Eventually, the path of heavy tree cover led to a clearing in a large field. We would always travel to this point before heading back to the house. Many deer and other wildlife would frequent that spot, which was always interesting to see. The grassy expanse was quite serene on nights when the full moon loomed overhead. I'd gotten caught up in a joke my husband had told me when my feet first hit the clearing on that night. When I turned my head to look forward, that's when I saw a sight I would never forget. There, in the moonlight, and roughly a mere 10 feet before me, stood what appeared to be a pair of scrawny bone-white legs. I squinted my eyes violently, willing them in succession to investigate the scene more. My gaze followed the legs upward until I realized they were attached to a matching torso. However, that was it. That was all that completed whatever the being or creature was. For a few seconds my brain went blank. The only 2 thoughts that were present was, it looked like some fucked up Silent Hill monstrosity. Secondly, I reasoned that it must be fake, because things like that simply do not exist in reality. All that came to a screeching halt when the legs began to move. In that moment, it was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing before the fear set in. Without thought, I let out a guttural scream that originated from within the depths of my throat. It tore from my mouth at an alarming rate. It was a perfect example of how the body and mind react upon terror-fueled reflexes. What came next was the infamous paralyzing fright you hear about that causes you to become immobilized and frozen in place. That feeling was then immediately replaced by fight or flight. I chose the flight option. Newfound strength entered my body, causing me to spring forward in one rapid movement. My hands gripped my husband's shoulders, and I pulled him back, practically sacrificing him to whatever abomination was behind us. It's somewhat funny in a morbid way how in times of fear we go into every man for himself mode. My poor husband had no idea what was happening. I glanced behind myself to see him standing there with a puzzled look on his face. I was still running but stopped because it finally clicked. The weird thing that had been behind us was nothing more than a horse with color markings that were oddly placed on its body. When I actually took the time to observe what it was, in a rational frame of mind, I could finally understand. My husband and I still laugh about the incident to this day. I can't help but feel a little silly about the whole ordeal, but if anything it sheds a light on how our brains process fear. So, dear fucked up nightmare fuel horse, let's not meet again. Thank you for watching another Monsters mashup. Big shout out to Dezombified for being a part of this. Don't forget to check out their channel, link is in the description below. Also a thank you to all the writers who provided stories for this event. Be sure to check out the description below for their links as well. Alright, have a good one. Catch you next time. Bye.